Cold cases that remain unsolved mysteries for decades have a way of lingering over the community in which they occurred. These unresolved true crime cases can haunt the family, friends, and loved ones of the person at the center of the mystery, and even investigators and bystanders can be drawn into the cloud of unease circling these stories. Luckily, thanks to major advancements in investigative technology, dozens of decades-old mysteries have been solved in 2022, bringing some form of closure to all of those involved. Number 5. Jennifer Brinkman's shocking death was a real-life horror story that baffled crime scene investigators in the small town of Marysville, Washington, for nearly 25 years. The unsolved mystery lingered over the community for decades. Who would attack a bright, social young woman? What could possibly be the reason? Although the motives for the violent attack may never be fully understood, investigators were finally able to close a chapter on this mysterious crime in late 2022, when DNA testing pinpointed the criminal who took Jennifer's life, a now 52-year-old man by the name of Jeffrey Paul Primo. Jeffrey may have met Jennifer from a phone chat line, which was popular with young people in the 1990s. Police identified the line as a nightline, a system where individuals could call in and connect with anonymous people of the opposite gender. Jennifer was a 19-year-old woman, still living with her father in his home. Undoubtedly, she was seeking social connections, particularly at a time when many of her peers had moved away to go to school or begin work. In addition to calling into phone chat lines, Jennifer was active on multiple online dating sites and was known to walk around town and chat with people she met. She also regularly walked to the local library to use their computers. Sometime in March of 1998, Jennifer was attacked in the bedroom of her father's home where she was staying. The exact date of the attack is still unknown, as it was not discovered until March 21st of 1998, when her father returned home from a planned vacation to California with his girlfriend. It's possible that the attacker knew of this vacation and that Jennifer would be alone. Crime scene investigators who arrived quickly at the scene determined that she'd been fatally struck in the neck by an axe. The weapon was found at the scene, and DNA was located on the weapon that did not belong to Jennifer. However, no matches were identified. Therefore, despite a complete profile being isolated, the unknown attacker was known as Individual A for more than 20 years. The attacker's DNA was also not found at any other crime scenes, suggesting Jennifer's passing may have been an isolated incident with a personal motive. Finally, in late 2020, the Marysville Police Department was able to further the investigation through the advancement of DNA testing and a process known as genetic genealogy. A private company called Parabon Nano Labs was able to identify a list of potential suspects. One of the suspects was none other than Jeffrey Primo. Jeffrey had been on the police radar for years due to a number of reasons. But most critical to this unsolved case was his habit of using the same chat lines as Jennifer. When police spoke to him in the 1990s, he claimed that he didn't know Jennifer. However, investigators uncovered a letter that he had purportedly written to her just before she passed. Although the contents of the letter have not been publicly released, Detective Wade Rediger of the Marysville Police says that the letter contained strong indications that there had been meetings prior and that they talked about some personal matters both on Jennifer's part and on the part of the suspect. In addition, it was revealed that Jeffrey had tried to schedule a meeting with Jennifer around the time of her death. It's not been confirmed whether or not this meeting actually occurred. However, the fact that Jeffrey did know Jennifer and lied about it was extremely concerning to investigators. But the lack of physical evidence meant that he could not be implicated, at least not until 2022. After Parabon Nano Labs provided Marysville Police with a list of potential suspects, detectives were able to obtain a warrant for Jeffrey's DNA, which he gave willingly. A comparison of his DNA to the DNA found on the murder weapon proved he was responsible for Jennifer's passing. On November 28, 2022, police announced the arrest of Jeffrey Primo for the 1998 attack on Jennifer Brinkman. As of December 2, 2022, Jeffrey was released from the Snohomish County, Washington jail on a $250,000 bond. Formal charges are pending, and Jeffrey will ultimately be tried sometime in 2023. After his arrest, Jeffrey invoked his constitutional right to remain silent, meaning the motive for Jennifer's killing remains unknown. However, the identification of her attacker is still a major victory for those working to achieve justice in her case. Number 4. The Unsolved Mysteries, the attacks on 2 Canadian women, 4 months apart, remained that way for nearly 40 years. Susan Tice, 45, and Aaron Gilmore, 22, had shockingly little in common. Susan Tice was a single mother of 4 children and a social worker who had recently moved to Toronto, Canada from Calgary. Aaron Gilmore was the 22-year-old daughter of a mining tycoon who dreamt of being a fashion designer, but both women were indelibly connected by the heinous crimes of the individual who took both of their lives in late 1983. In both cases, the crimes were eerily similar. Susan and Aaron were both attacked inside of their own homes. The women had been assaulted and fatally stabbed. Susan was the killer's first victim. She'd recently separated from her husband and moved into a house on Grace Street alone. Susan had plans to attend a family function in August of 1983. When she failed to arrive, her brother-in-law visited her home to check in on her, where he made a horrific discovery. Susan's body was found in her ransacked home on August 17, 1983. Mail had piled up outside, indicating that she'd passed away some time before. An autopsy confirmed that a series of stab wounds to the chest were the cause of death. However, the exact date of the attack was undetermined. Crime scene investigators made little headway in her case. Susan had no enemies, and the attacker had left behind very little usable evidence. Detectives were still working her case when 4 months later, on December 20th, 1983, the perpetrator struck again. Aaron Gilmore was found in the bedroom of her Yorkville apartment, approximately 4 kilometers from Susan's home. Like Susan, she had been assaulted and fatally stabbed, but the evidence trail seemed to end there. Aaron and Susan did not know each other, nor did they run in the same social circles. Their homes were reasonably close, but they were by no means neighbors. Despite the best efforts of investigators, both cases ran cold. The 2 crime mysteries became stories that haunted the public and unsettled detectives, but they seemed destined to be solved. A break in the case did not come until 2008. Thanks to advances in DNA technology, police made a shocking discovery. Susan and Aaron were connected after all. The same individual had been present at both crime scenes. An unidentified male perpetrator had carried out both of the attacks. Toronto police made an appeal to the public in November of 2008 after this discovery was made, and again in March of 2016. However, it would take an additional 15 years and the advent of new DNA analysis techniques, known as genetic genealogy, for investigators to determine exactly who was responsible for the violent crime. Genetic genealogy involves identifying an individual through that person's family tree. Starting in 2019, Canadian investigators collaborated with a private scientific company based in the US called Othram Labs. Using traces of DNA left at the crime scenes by the attacker, Othram developed a full profile of the unknown man. Scientists then traced his family tree to narrow in on it. However, there was a catch. Using the DNA of relatives to find the criminal meant that Othram was at first unable to reduce the suspect listing to fewer than 5. This was because the attacker came from a family of 5 brothers, and without a direct DNA sample to compare Othram's profile to, any of them could have been responsible. In order to find the perpetrator, police had to rely on old-fashioned detective work, cross-checking alibis and locations of each brother in 1983. They eventually honed in on their suspect, 61-year-old Joseph George Sutherland. Joseph had been in his early 20s at the time of the murders. Although he was living in Toronto at the time, he had since moved to Moosonee, a tiny, remote town of just 1,500 people. He had never been considered a suspect or even been interviewed in either case. Without genetic genealogy, it's possible that he would have never been apprehended. According to CBC News, in most cases involving DNA evidence, police will attempt to surreptitiously collect DNA from a suspect and then match it against crime scene evidence prior to executing a warrant. However, in Joseph's case, investigators were unable to collect his DNA, so they had to go directly to a judge. Reports say that convincing the judge was a rare move but necessary. On November 25, 2022, Joseph was apprehended at his rural home and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. After almost 40 years, he was finally brought to justice. Number 3. On October 3, 1974, 2 teenage boys, current and former students at Aloha High School in Beaverton, Oregon, had their lives cut short in a shocking and mysterious true crime that horrified the local community. Peter Zito Jr., aged 18, and Donald Bartran had been at the Oak Hills Recreational Center the night before with a number of other teenagers. The pair were good friends despite the 2-year age gap, and the fact that Peter had recently dropped out of high school. Their bodies were found by Peter's 1956 Oldsmobile, which family later described as his greatest love. Both had been shot several times at point-blank range. Peter was found near the car, while Donald was slumped inside the engine compartment, where he had been trying to fix the car. A newspaper delivery driver spotted them just before 4 a.m. Within hours of the discovery, police thought that they'd identified the perpetrator, another 18-year-old Aloha High School student named Joseph Amir Wilson. Joseph had been in a fight with someone at the community center just a few hours earlier, on Friday night. The unidentified assailant had beaten him up and his brother, and police reportedly suspected that Joseph had wanted to get even and had mistakenly targeted Peter and Donald for the attack. Crucially, Joseph also already had a criminal gun record, and he had no alibi for Friday night. He told police he'd spent the night in a field near the crime scene before walking to a gas station and using a payphone to call a taxi at about 2 a.m. Joseph maintained his innocence, but he was arrested and charged for the murders. He was held in jail for nearly 4 months while investigators gathered evidence. However, trace metal detection analysis on his hands was used to determine if he had recently fired a weapon, but it came back negative, and he passed 2 lie detector tests, which were reviewed and confirmed by 5 independent analysts. Joseph was ultimately released and finished out his senior year at Aloha High, after serving 4 months for a crime which he had no role in. After graduating, Joseph became a landscaper, ultimately becoming his own employer. He passed away in 2000 at the age of 43. In 2022, Sheriff Pat Garrett formally apologized to his relatives for the wrongful arrest, saying that he should never have been arrested. Back in 1975, after Joseph was released, police once again found themselves at square one for the unsolved mystery of Peter and Donald's deaths. They began to review other suspects, including another local teenager by the name of Stephen Chris. Stephen, who was 17 at the time of the attack, worked with Donald at a restaurant and may have had a reason to be upset with him. Detectives have not specified why. But in December of 1974, Stephen was arrested on an unrelated criminal charge. An illegally concealed .22 caliber handgun was found in his car at this time, and the weapon was taken for ballistics testing. According to a news article published on Oregon Live, ballistics testing in the 1970s usually involved an expert using a microscope to compare a test fire from the suspected weapon to a slug retrieved from the crime scene. This method was not foolproof, and it may have been the reason Stephen's weapon was originally found not to match the bullets found at the scene of the crime. Investigators returned the gun to Stephen and continued to look into other suspects in Peter and Donald's case. Meanwhile, Stephen went on to join the US Army, where he was stationed at Fort Lewis in Washington. Almost 2 years to the day after the attacks on Peter and Donald, Stephen committed another shooting. He killed his commanding officer, Sergeant Jacob Brown. According to military police, the horrendous true crime was committed because Stephen had damaged his commanding officer's car and owed him a few $100s. Instead of paying Sergeant Brown back, Stephen ended his life with a .22 caliber handgun. Stephen confessed to the crime and pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison but was paroled after 12. Because he confessed of his own free will, the military police never went back to check the ballistics on his gun, thus eliminating another chance to compare the crime with Peter and Donald's deaths. It wasn't until 2022, nearly 35 years after Stephen's release, that incriminating crime scene evidence was re-examined using new digital technology. As part of a cold case initiative recently launched by the Sheriff's Office in Oregon, the ballistic evidence from 1974 was tested with new 3D modeling technology. The computerized analysis proved without a doubt that the same weapon was used to kill Peter Zito, Donald Bartran, and Sergeant Jacob Brown, the handgun belonging to Stephen Criss. On November 4th, 2022, Stephen Criss, now age 65, was indicted for the slayings of Peter and Donald. He was taken into custody with the same handcuffs used in his December of 1974 arrest. According to the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, it was the oldest ballistics match ever made on a prosecutable case. Nearly 50 years later, justice has finally been served. Number 2. In October of 2022, the fresh-faced Gemma Mitchell made headlines when she was the first woman in England to be sentenced to life in prison on television. Her crime? The shocking murder of her friend, 67-year-old Mi Quinn Chong. The real-life horror story and subsequent crime mystery of Gemma's horrifying actions transfixed a nation and taught all those who tuned in that people aren't always what they seem. Mi Quinn Chong, who went by the name Deborah, was a 67-year-old widower living in Wembley, England. She suffered from mental health issues, particularly schizophrenia, and relied heavily on a network of supporters to help her cope with daily life, including members of her church. Most of Deborah's family was located in Malaysia, so when her mental health declined, she sought external help, including from unlikely sources such as the Prince of Wales and then Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Her choice of public figures suggests a woman who knew that she needed help but was unsure of where to turn to get it. It was into this environment that Gemma Mitchell came. 38-year-old Gemma befriended Deborah through a church group and quickly appointed herself the older woman's spiritual healer. Gemma, a British citizen who was raised in Australia, was a trained osteopath who maintained a website where she claimed to be attuned to subjects in neuroanatomy, genetics, and dissection of human cadavers. However, she had never registered with the United Kingdom's General Osteopathic Council, so she could not legally practice in England. Instead, she began styling herself as a healer, offering ill-defined holistic services to vulnerable individuals such as Deborah. Meanwhile, Gemma was embroiled in a lengthy and costly home renovation, which she was trying to convince Deborah to bankroll. Gemma had a pattern of taking advantage of those near her. A former friend named Karen Juratek was a teenager when she struck up a friendship with the then early 30s Gemma at a Christian conference in 2018. Karen told the Daily Mail that she and Gemma chatted on the phone daily, and she'd even stayed at the older woman's apartment. However, Jennifer was going behind Karen's back to send flirty and inappropriate messages to her boyfriend, also a teenager. When Karen discovered the betrayal, she ended the relationship immediately, and Gemma seemed to move on to another target, Deborah, who was wealthy, isolated, and struggling. According to crime scene investigators, Gemma was particularly interested in Deborah for her money. The pair developed a close relationship, and Deborah reportedly told Gemma she would help with her home repairs to the tune of £200,000, approximately $240,000 US. Whether Deborah actually made this promise or Gemma just believed she did is unknown. Some reports suggest that Deborah told Gemma she ought to sell her house and enjoy the money instead. Either way, the money never materialized, and Gemma was furious. She quickly hatched a depraved plan to get the money she so greatly desired. She would forge a copy of Deborah's will, leaving 95% of the older woman's estate in her name. Police detective Jim Eastwood, who led the investigation into Deborah's death, said that money was the clear motivator for Gemma's callous actions, and she showed a significant degree of planning and calculation. On or about June 11th of 2021, Gemma created and stashed a forged will that indicated she was due to receive 95% of Deborah's £700,000 estate. She placed the fake will in Deborah's home, and while there, she attacked her friend with an unidentified weapon, causing her untimely passing. The whole thing was proved by a shocking piece of crime scene evidence. CCTV footage outside of Deborah's home captured Gemma on the morning of June 11th arriving with 2 large blue suitcases. 4 hours later, she's captured on camera leaving the home, struggling to pull the suitcases, which appear much heavier and unwieldy. Investigators believe Deborah's body was contained within. When Deborah's tenants asked about her location, Gemma told them that she went to stay with family friends somewhere near the ocean. She also called a missing persons charity several weeks later and told them the same story. However, Deborah was not near the ocean at all. Instead, Gemma stored her friend in the garden of her home for more than 2 weeks. Then, on June 26th, she rented a car and drove Deborah's remains to the coastal town of Salcombe, where she left them on an overgrown pathway. Along the way, her car blew a tire and she stopped at a service station for assistance, where the person who helped her said that there was an odd, musty smell in the vehicle. All told, the drive was more than 200 miles each way. It would have taken Gemma hours of driving, not to mention a significant amount of pre-planning to find the isolated spot. However, it was clear that the site was not as isolated as Gemma believed. The body was discovered less than a day later by a group of tourists. However, it was not able to be immediately identified due to extensive decomposition. In addition, Deborah's head had been removed and was found a few meters away from her body. Once police identified Deborah and began to speak to those who knew her, Gemma immediately emerged as a suspect. She was arrested in July of 2021, but it was not until October 27th of 2022 that she was formally tried and found guilty of the attack. She maintained her innocence throughout the trial. However, the facts are clear. Gemma will serve at least 34 years in prison for this heinous true crime. Number 1. More than 60 years ago, a student at LaSalle College made a horrifying discovery. On February 23, 1957, a young man was in a wooded area of northeast Philadelphia, reportedly to spy on a woman at a nearby girl's home. He spotted what he thought was an abandoned doll in some bushes, but didn't pay it much thought. 2 days later, he heard a news story about a missing girl and worriedly called the police. His hunch turned out to be right. Tragically, what he had seen that day was not a doll, but the body of a missing child. However, it was not the girl on the news, but rather an unidentified little boy, aged 4 to 6. The cold weather made it difficult to determine how long he had been there. His hair had recently been cut and his nails had been trimmed. He was wrapped in a flannel blanket. Nothing hinted at who he had been in life, and no one had reported him missing. The mysterious crime of his passing was a real-life horror story of an innocent child who had apparently slipped through all the cracks. For decades, the unsolved mystery of the boy's identity was one of the oldest and most well-known cases in the United States. He became known as America's missing child, or more commonly, the boy in the box. Crime scene investigators devoted hundreds of hours of manpower to uncovering the unknown child's identity. The box he was found in was marked furniture and was found to originally contain a bassinet, which was sold at a nearby store. Police tracked down the buyer, but there was no connection to the boy. It seemed like whoever had placed him at the site had found the boy there. A man's corduroy cap was found at the site, but the owner was unable to be identified. After the crime scene was a dead end, investigators turned their focus to the child himself to see if they could uncover any clues to his identity. They distributed hundreds of thousands of flyers with reconstructions of the boy's face, placed ads in newspapers, and even sent out photos with utility bills, but no one came forward. Nor did the boy seem to have lived in an orphanage or any other institution. No doctor had a record of his care. It was as if he had lived a completely undocumented life for years. Adding to the horror story was the fact that the young boy had been severely malnourished and mistreated in life. His cause of death was a violent physical assault. His hair had also been recently cut so that clumps of it were found with his body, suggesting his shaved head was an attempt to obscure his identity. The boy received a full medical workup at autopsy by Dr. Joseph Spellman, Philadelphia's chief medical examiner. In addition to the recent bruises inflicted upon the young boy, Dr. Spellman noticed that the boy had a number of scars, some surgical and some related to previous injuries. In addition to his surgical scars, the boy may have had recent exposure to a diagnostic dye used to treat chronic eye disease. It seemed that even though he was malnourished and abused, he'd received medical care in his short life. However, he had no vaccination marks, suggesting that he had not been enrolled in public school. His feet and right hand were pruny, suggesting that he'd been submerged in water immediately before or after his passing. His cause of death, though, was head trauma. 5 months after he was discovered, the boy was buried in a potter's field in Philadelphia. His headstone read, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." For decades, the young child's cold case languished. No one came forward to claim the unsolved mystery. No movement on the case was made until nearly the end of the 20th century, when several things happened all at once. In 1998, the boy's body was exhumed to attempt to obtain DNA samples. However, a viable profile was unable to be developed at this point. This attempt did coincide with increasing media attention to the by now 40-year-old case, and this led to perhaps the only credible lead investigators ever received. In February of 2002, a woman who has only been identified as M came to the police with the story of the boy's identity. She told investigators that her mother had purchased the boy, who was named Jonathan, from his birth parents sometime in the summer of 1954. The woman's mother, who abused her daughter, was also physically abusive towards Jonathan. He was kept in the basement of their suburban Philadelphia home and was not allowed outdoors. M told the police that on the night of Jonathan's passing, her mother had beaten him in a fit of rage after he vomited baked beans. Afterward, she claimed that her mother bathed the boy in an attempt to clean him and wake him up, but it was too late. M's theory matched the evidence found at autopsy by Dr. Spellman. The boy had likely been in a bath, and his stomach contained baked beans. In addition, M said her mother cut Jonathan's long hair and drove him to a secluded, vacant lot to abandon his body. While M and her mother were preparing to remove Jonathan from the trunk of the car, a passing driver pulled over to see if they needed help. M told the police they ignored him, and he eventually drove away. This story matched with a confidential witness testimony given to investigators in 1957. Despite the veracity of M's claims, there were also problems with her story. M had a long history of mental illness, making her an unreliable witness. No one was able to corroborate her claims, and neighbors of the family denied that there had been a young boy living in the home with M and her mother in the 1950s. Without conclusive evidence, M's testimony did not further the boy's cold case. The mystery stagnated for another 15 years until April of 2019, when a court granted investigators approval to attempt DNA analysis once again. Modern techniques meant that scientists were actually able to develop a complete profile. According to one researcher, Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, the difficulty really was up front because the DNA was like confetti. The boy was buried in 1957, So 65 years or so later, the DNA was basically done for. However, using newly developed modern techniques, the DNA fragments were able to be connected together, ultimately showing a complete profile. The entire process took 2.5 years. After the boy's DNA profiling was complete, investigators employed genetic genealogy to find the boy's relatives on his maternal side. Using a combination of genealogy and the city of Philadelphia's vital records, they were able to find a birth certificate which also listed the boy's father. On Thursday, December 8, 2022, police announced that the boy in the box was Joseph August Zarelli, born on January 13, 1953. He would have just had his 4th birthday a few weeks before he passed away in 1957. Investigators have not publicly released the names of Joseph's parents. Although both parents are deceased, he reportedly has living half-siblings on both his maternal and paternal sides. His mother had at least 3 other children. Joseph's mother and father were not married, and he was born in an era when births out of wedlock were perceived as shameful. This could explain why none of his siblings reported him missing. His identity may have been a secret. Although Joseph's identity has been restored to him, Philadelphia police caution the public to remember that he is still at the center of an active case. It's now more crucial than ever to discover who is responsible for the death of this innocent young boy. The Philadelphia Police Commissioner, Daniel Outlaw, told reporters that this is still an active homicide investigation, and we still need the public's help in filling in this child's story. This announcement only closes one chapter in this little boy's story, while opening up a new one. Commissioner Outlaw and the Philadelphia Police Department have asked anyone with information about Joseph to call 215-686-TIPS. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.